Before I begin, if you've ever lived through humiliation, betrayal, or being made to feel small inside your own family, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Your stories matter too, even the ones you've never said out loud. I never imagined Christmas would be the day everything finally broke open. For years, I had carried myself carefully around my husband's son, like someone walking on thin ice without skates, hoping if I moved slowly enough, quietly enough, I wouldn't fall through. His name is Daniel. He was 17 when I married his father, and from the very beginning, he made it clear I was a guest in his life, not family. I told myself that was normal. Grief does strange things to children, and Daniel had lost his mother young. I kept repeating that to myself every time he ignored me at dinner, every time he spoke over me, every time he referred to me as your wife instead of using my name. I'm 56 now. I was 41 when I married Robert. I remember standing in the courthouse, holding his hand, thinking that love at this age felt calmer, steadier, like a fire that didn't need to burn the house down to keep you warm. Robert was kind, dependable, a man who listened more than he spoke. After my divorce, that felt like oxygen. Daniel stood a few feet away that day, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes somewhere far behind me. I tried to smile at him. He didn't smile back. I moved into their house 6 weeks later. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but warm. Daniel's mother had decorated it years ago, and her presence lingered in quiet ways. The curtains she'd chosen, the floral plates no one used, the photo frames still hanging in the hallway. I never touched those things, not because Robert asked me not to, but because I didn't feel entitled to erase her. I wanted Daniel to see that I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I was just trying to belong. Belonging, it turns out, is something you can spend decades chasing and still never catch. Christmas had always been complicated in that house. Daniel hated the holidays. He tolerated them at best. Robert tried every year to make it feel normal again. Tree, lights, dinner at the big oak table. I helped quietly, never pushing my traditions too hard. I made the sides, wrapped the gifts, set the table. I learned to stay in the background, because every time I stepped forward, Daniel seemed to step back harder. Still, this Christmas felt different. Daniel was 32 now. He had a good job, a sharp tongue, and a confidence that filled the room. He was bringing his girlfriend, Melissa, and for weeks Robert had been hopeful in a way I hadn't seen before. Maybe this year, he kept saying, maybe we'll all finally feel like a family. I nodded, smiled, and folded napkins. I had learned not to say maybe out loud. It felt like tempting fate. That afternoon, I cooked for hours. The house smelled like rosemary and butter and roasted turkey. I wore a soft blue sweater, nothing flashy. I had learned that looking too put together made Daniel roll his eyes like I was trying too hard. I just wanted the day to pass peacefully. That was my only wish. They arrived just before sunset. Melissa was polite, distant, the way someone is when they've already heard stories about you. Daniel barely acknowledged me, heading straight for the living room with a drink in his hand. Robert followed him, trying to bridge a gap that had been there for decades. I stayed in the kitchen, breathing, telling myself not to take it personally. I told myself a lot of things that night. Dinner started quietly enough. Plates were passed, polite conversation floated above the clinking of silverware. I relaxed a little. I remember thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe we've finally grown past all that old tension. Then Daniel stood up. He didn't raise his voice. That's what made it worse. He tapped his glass lightly, like someone about to give a toast, and everyone looked at him. Robert smiled, hopeful. My stomach tightened. I knew that feeling, the one where your body knows something before your mind catches up. I just want to say something, Daniel said, glancing around the table, then landing his eyes on me. Since it's Christmas, since we're all being honest. The room went quiet. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I think it's time we stopped pretending. This isn't really your house, he nodded toward me, and you're not really family, so maybe it's time you moved on, tonight. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. My ears rang. My face burned. Melissa's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Someone laughed nervously. I still don't know who. Robert stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Daniel, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice shaking. Daniel shrugged. "Just saying what everyone's thinking. She's been living here rent-free for years. Mom's house, our house. And honestly, it's awkward pretending she belongs here when she doesn't." Every pair of eyes turned toward me. I felt suddenly very aware of my hands, folded neatly in my lap, trembling despite my best efforts. I had been humiliated before in my life, but never like this. Never so publicly, never in my own dining room, with food I had cooked, surrounded by people I had tried so hard to love. I didn't cry. That surprised even me. Something inside me went very still, very clear. I stood up slowly, the way you do when you don't want anyone to see you shake. I looked at Daniel, then at Robert, who looked like his heart was breaking in real time. "If you'll excuse me," I said softly, "I need to get something." Daniel smirked. "Packing already? That was fast." I didn't respond. I walked down the hallway, past the photos, past the quiet memories, into the bedroom that had been mine for 15 years. I opened the small safe at the back of the closet, the one Robert and I had placed there together, and I took out the folder that I had kept untouched for years, the one I had hoped I would never need. When I walked back into the dining room, the air felt heavy, expectant. Everyone looked at me like they were waiting for a breakdown, an apology, tears. I placed the folder gently on the table and looked at Daniel. "I think you're right," I said calmly. "It is time we stopped pretending." And that's when everything began to change. Daniel leaned back in his chair like he'd won something, like this was a game he'd been waiting to finish for years. Robert's hands hovered uselessly in the air, as if he wanted to stop time but didn't know where to touch it. I could feel every heartbeat in my ears, but my voice came out steady, almost gentle, surprising even me. I opened the folder slowly, not for drama, not to prove a point, but because truth deserves to be handled carefully. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years, papers Robert and I had signed quietly, responsibly, long before Daniel decided to make a spectacle of me. "I never wanted this to be public," I said, resting my fingers lightly on the table. "Especially not on Christmas." I looked around the room, at faces caught somewhere between curiosity and discomfort. "But since we're being honest tonight, here it is." Daniel rolled his eyes. "What, a sob story? Because I'm not interested." "This house," I continued, ignoring him, "was refinanced 12 years ago. After your father's heart attack." I paused, letting that sink in. Robert swallowed hard. He remembered. Of course he did. "At the time, Robert couldn't qualify on his own. His credit was fragile, so I used my savings, my inheritance from my mother. I put my name on the mortgage, not because I wanted power, because I wanted security for both of us." Daniel's smile faltered for just a moment, barely noticeable, but I saw it. I slid one paper forward, turning it so he could read the heading. "I've been paying half the mortgage since then, every month, sometimes more. I also paid for the roof repair, the kitchen remodel, and the property taxes when your father was out of work." I took a breath. "Legally, this is my house, too." The silence that followed was thick, almost physical. Melissa shifted in her seat. Robert finally sat down, his face pale, eyes glossy. Daniel stared at the paper like it might rearrange itself if he looked long enough. "That's not possible," he said finally. "Dad wouldn't." "He did," Robert said quietly. His voice cracked on the last word. "Because she saved us, Daniel, over and over again." Daniel stood up so abruptly his chair tipped backward. "You went behind my back," he snapped, pointing at me. "You planned this. You always plan this." I shook my head slowly. "No, I planned for the future. There's a difference. And I never hid it. I just didn't announce it. I didn't think I had to justify protecting myself." For the first time that night, I felt something other than shame or hurt. I felt tired, bone-deep tired of shrinking, of explaining, of making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw not a villain, but a wounded man who had never learned how to share space with grief. "I never tried to take your mother's place," I said softly. "I respected her memory. I respected you, but respect doesn't mean erasing myself." He laughed sharply. "You think some papers mean you win?" "I'm not trying to win," I replied. "I'm trying to end this pretending, the pretending that I'm a guest, the pretending that my contributions don't count, the pretending that humiliation is something I should accept quietly." Robert finally found his voice again. "Daniel," he said, his tone firmer than I'd heard in years, "you owe her an apology." Daniel looked at his father like he'd been slapped. "You're taking her side?" "I'm taking the side of decency, something I should have done a long time ago." That sentence landed harder than anything else that night. I saw it in Daniel's face, the way anger gave way to something closer to fear. Not fear of me, but fear of losing control of a story he told himself for years. The story where I was the intruder, the enemy, the easy target. I closed the folder gently. "I didn't come back in here to throw you out. I came back to tell you I won't be leaving like this. Not tonight, not ever again. If you want me gone, that's a conversation we can have, a legal one, a respectful one, but you don't get to shame me into disappearing." No one spoke for a long moment. The clock ticked on. Christmas lights blinked softly in the corner, absurdly cheerful. Melissa cleared her throat. "I didn't know any of this," she said, her voice uncertain. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him. "You told me she was just staying here." Daniel didn't answer. His jaw tightened, eyes darting away. Robert stood and walked around the table to me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, warm and grounding. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "not just for tonight, but for years of silence." I nodded. It was too late for apologies to fix everything, but they still mattered. Dinner was abandoned after that. No one touched dessert. Melissa left early, citing a headache that didn't fool anyone. Daniel stormed out without another word, slamming the door so hard an ornament fell from the tree and shattered. I stared at the broken glass on the floor, thinking how it felt fitting. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, Robert and I sat together on the couch. The folder rested between us, unopened. "I should have protected you," he said, staring at his hands. "I thought staying neutral would keep the peace." I leaned back, exhausted. Neutrality always favors the loudest person, and I've been quiet a long time. He nodded slowly, like someone finally learning a hard lesson. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked around the room, at the life I had built carefully, patiently, often invisibly. Now, I said, we decide whether this family can grow up or whether it finally has to face the truth. Upstairs, the guest room light flicked on. Daniel was still there, at least for the night, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. I had my voice back, and that, I was learning, changed everything. Morning came quietly, the way it always does after a night that feels too heavy to carry into daylight. I woke before the sun, my mind already moving, replaying every word from the night before. For years, I'd started my mornings with a familiar knot in my chest, bracing myself for whatever tension might come next. But that morning felt different. The knot was still there, but looser, like something that had finally been acknowledged instead of ignored. I lay there listening to the house breathe, the hum of the heater, the faint creak of old floorboards, the distant sound of a car passing outside. This house had held so much of my life: birthdays, arguments, quiet Sunday mornings, long nights when Robert's health scared me half to death. I had loved it the way you love a place that never fully loves you back, hoping time would soften its edges. Downstairs, I could hear movement. Daniel was up. I stayed in bed longer than usual, giving him space, giving myself courage. When I finally walked into the kitchen, he was standing at the counter, staring at his phone, untouched coffee going cold beside him. He looked older somehow, smaller. "Morning," I said. He flinched slightly, then nodded without looking at me. "Morning." The silence stretched. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hands steady. I didn't feel the need to fill the quiet anymore. That, too, was new. "I didn't mean for last night to go that far," he said suddenly. His voice was flat, rehearsed. "I was drunk." I took a sip, considering my words. Being drunk doesn't invent feelings. It just removes the filter. He finally looked at me then, eyes sharp. "You think I hate you?" "I think you've been angry for a long time, and it was easier to aim it at me than at the loss you never got to grieve properly." He scoffed, but there was no heat in it. "You don't know anything about my grief." "I know what it looks like when it turns into cruelty," I said. "I've lived with it for 15 years. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His shoulders sagged. For a moment, I saw the 17-year-old boy again, standing stiffly at a courthouse wedding, arms crossed like armor. "I just didn't want this to stop being Mom's house," he muttered. "I know," I said softly, "but houses don't belong to memories alone. They belong to the people who take care of them, who show up." Robert came in then, sensing the tension. He didn't interrupt. He simply poured himself coffee and sat down. The three of us shared the space carefully, like people learning a new language together. "Daniel," Robert said finally, "we need to talk about boundaries and respect." Daniel nodded stiffly. "I get it." "No," Robert replied, firm but not unkind. "You're starting to get it. That's different." After breakfast, Daniel left without another word. No door slamming this time, just quiet. I watched him go, unsure whether this was an ending or just a pause. In the days that followed, something shifted in the house. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was honesty. Robert apologized again, this time with actions. He corrected Daniel when his tone sharpened. He stopped asking me to be the bigger person. I stopped volunteering to be small. A week later, Daniel asked to meet me for coffee, just me. I almost said no. Protecting yourself sometimes means knowing when not to reopen a wound, but curiosity won. He looked nervous when I arrived, tapping his fingers against the mug. He said that Melissa broke up with him abruptly. I raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry." He said she saw a side of him she didn't like, said I was cruel for no reason. I nodded. Sometimes it takes an outside mirror. He stared into his coffee. I was wrong about you, he quietly. I didn't rush to reassure him. I'd learned better. Being wrong isn't the same as making amends. Those take time. I know, he replied. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just a chance to not be enemies. I considered that. The past didn't vanish just because someone finally acknowledged it. Neither did the future. I'm willing to try. Slowly. He exhaled, relief clear on his face. At home, I started making changes, small ones at first. I replaced the curtains in the living room with ones I'd chosen myself. I hung a photo of my mother in the hallway. Each change felt like a quiet declaration. I am here. I belong to myself, if nothing else. One evening, Robert found me labeling folders at the dining table. He asked, "What's all this?" "Organization and preparation," I said. "For what?" "For whatever comes next. I spent too many years assuming stability meant silence." He nodded thoughtfully. "I don't want you to feel trapped here." "I don't," I said, "but I won't feel invisible either." That winter, we started counseling, family counseling. Daniel resisted at first, then showed up anyway. Sessions were messy, honest, painful, necessary. There were tears I'd waited years to see, anger finally spoken instead of sharpened. And through it all, I learned something I wish I'd known sooner. Dignity doesn't come from being accepted. It comes from refusing to accept disrespect. By spring, the house felt lighter, not perfect, real. Daniel still struggled. I still had scars, but we were no longer pretending. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet again, I would sit in the living room and think about that Christmas dinner, about the moment I stood up, not to run, but to speak. That was the night I stopped asking for permission to exist. Spring didn't fix everything, but it revealed things the cold had hidden. Light came through the windows differently, showing dust in the corners and cracks in the walls I'd stopped noticing. In a strange way, it felt honest. Nothing was being covered up anymore, not in the house and not in us. Daniel started coming by less often, but when he did, he stayed longer. He spoke slower, listened more. Sometimes we sat across from each other at the kitchen table in silence, not awkward, just careful. Trust, I was learning, isn't rebuilt with big apologies. It's rebuilt with consistency. One afternoon, he surprised me by asking about my life before his father. No one in that house had ever asked me that before. I told him about my first marriage, the quiet loneliness of it, the way I learned to disappear to keep the peace. I told him about my mother, how she raised me to believe endurance was the same thing as love. He listened, really listened, his eyes softening in places I hadn't seen before. "I think I was afraid," he admitted, staring at the floor. "If I let you matter, it meant admitting Mom was really gone." I nodded. Grief makes us build walls, but walls don't just keep pain out, they keep connection out too. Robert watched these moments from a distance, careful not to interfere, but I could see the relief in him. He had lived too long torn between his wife and his son, thinking choosing silence was the same as choosing harmony. He was learning too. That summer, I did something I'd postponed for years. I took a trip by myself. Just a week. A small coastal town, a quiet hotel, mornings with coffee and no one needing anything from me. When I told Robert, he hesitated, then smiled. "You deserve that," he said. It wasn't permission, it was support. On that trip, I walked along the shore and thought about the woman I'd been when I first entered that family, how careful she was, how hopeful, how afraid. I forgave her. She'd done the best she could with what she knew then. When I came home, the house greeted me differently, not because it had changed, but because I had. I rearranged furniture, cleared out boxes that didn't belong to anyone anymore. I stopped waiting to be invited into rooms I already had the right to enter. Daniel noticed. "You seem lighter," he said one evening. "I stopped carrying what was never mine to hold," I replied. That fall, he brought someone new to dinner. He asked first, not out of obligation, but respect. It mattered. She was kind, open, unguarded. I saw how he watched her reactions, how careful he was not to repeat old patterns. Growth isn't loud. Sometimes it's just quieter harm. One night after they left, Robert took my hand. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not leaving," he said, "and for not letting us stay the same." I squeezed his hand. Staying only matters if you're allowed to be whole. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a shared responsibility. And for the first time, Christmas didn't loom over us like a threat. It was just a day, a meal, a chance, not a test. As winter approached again, I caught myself hanging lights with genuine excitement, not to prove anything, not to keep peace, just because I wanted to. I thought about that night a year ago, the humiliation, the shock, the quiet power of telling the truth. I realized something important then. Respect doesn't come from time served, it comes from boundaries held. And if I learned anything from all of this, it was that love without dignity isn't love at all. It's endurance. And I was done enduring. By the time the holidays circled back around, I noticed something unexpected in myself. I wasn't bracing anymore. The familiar tension that used to creep into my shoulders as winter approached was gone. I still remembered what had happened, of course, but the memory no longer controlled me. It felt like a scar instead of an open wound. Tender if pressed, but no longer bleeding. Daniel called in early December. That alone would have been unthinkable a year earlier. "I was wondering," he said carefully, "if you'd help me with Christmas dinner this year." He paused, then added, "Only if you want to." I smiled to myself, phone pressed to my ear. "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. We planned together, not just the menu, but the pacing of the day. Who would come, who wouldn't. Boundaries were discussed openly, not assumed. It felt strange at first, like learning to walk on a leg that had healed crooked, but was finally straightening out. On Christmas Eve, I stood in the kitchen again, but it felt different this time. Not like a stage I had to perform on, but like a place I actually belonged. Daniel chopped vegetables beside me, asking questions, sometimes messing things up, sometimes laughing at himself. Robert hovered nearby, happy in a way that didn't feel forced. When we sat down to eat, there were fewer people, but more honesty. No speeches, no toasts, just food and conversation and an ease that came from knowing no one was going to be blindsided. At one point, Daniel looked at me across the table. "You owe me something," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "You don't owe me anything tonight." "I owe you acknowledgement," he said, "for staying when you didn't have to, and for not turning me into the villain, even when I acted like one." The table went quiet. I felt emotion rise, but I didn't fight it. "We all play roles we didn't audition for," I said. "What matters is whether we're willing to rewrite them." He nodded, eyes shining. That was enough. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the house settled into its familiar quiet, I sat alone in the living room, lights glowing softly. I thought about how close I'd come to walking out that door the year before, convinced that leaving would be the only way to keep my dignity intact. What I'd learned instead was more complicated and more powerful. Dignity isn't about staying or leaving. It's about choice. It's about knowing you can walk away and choosing to stay only if the space you're staying in honors you. I also understood something else then. Daniel's cruelty hadn't been personal, even when it felt devastatingly so. It had been inherited pain, unexamined grief, passed down like an heirloom no one wanted to open. That didn't excuse it, but it explained it. And understanding had freed me from carrying resentment that was never meant to be mine. In the months that followed, life didn't turn into a perfect montage. There were still awkward moments. Old habits don't vanish overnight. But every time tension surfaced, it was addressed. Not buried, not laughed off. Addressed. That was the difference. I started volunteering again, something I'd given up years earlier when I felt like my energy had to be rationed carefully at home. I took a class. I reconnected with friends I'd slowly drifted from. My world expanded, and with it, my sense of self. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He held a small envelope. He said, "I want you to have this." Inside was a handwritten note. No grand declarations, just a few lines. Thank you for staying. Thank you for standing up for yourself. Thank you for showing me what strength actually looks like. I folded it carefully and placed it in the same safe where the old documents still rested, not as proof of ownership, but as proof of growth. Looking back now, I don't think that Christmas dinner shocked everyone because of the documents or the confrontation. It shocked them because I didn't do what was expected of me. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. I didn't disappear. I stood still and spoke the truth calmly. And that kind of strength unsettles people far more than anger ever could. If you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel like a guest in your own life, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't earn respect by enduring disrespect quietly. You earn it by deciding at some point that you matter enough to be heard. That Christmas didn't end my story. It started the chapter where I finally became the author of it. After that Christmas time, something subtle but lasting settled into our lives. Not happiness in the shiny postcard sense, but steadiness, the kind that comes when no one is waiting for the next blow. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd spent anticipating conflict until I no longer had to. Mornings felt quieter inside my head. Even the house sounded different, like it wasn't holding its breath anymore. Daniel and I didn't suddenly become close. We didn't hug every time we saw each other or trade inside jokes. What we built was slower and more fragile than that, but also more honest. We spoke plainly. If something bothered us, we said it before it festered. Sometimes the conversations were uncomfortable, but they didn't feel dangerous anymore. One evening in early spring, Daniel asked if I would go with him to clean out his mother's old storage unit. The request caught me off guard. He'd held on to that unit for over a decade, paying monthly fees just to avoid opening boxes he wasn't ready to face. I hesitated not because I didn't want to help, but because I didn't want to overstep. "You don't have to," he said quickly. "I just thought, you're good at not making things worse." I smiled softly. That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. The unit smelled like dust and cardboard and time. We worked quietly at first, pulling out boxes, reading labels in his mother's handwriting. Every so often, Daniel would stop, lost in a memory, and I'd wait. I didn't rush him. I didn't fill the silence. I'd learned that silence, when chosen, can be a form of respect. When he finally opened a box of old Christmas decorations, he laughed softly. "She loved tacky stuff," he said. "The louder, the better." "I noticed," I replied, thinking of the ornaments that still hung on our tree. He looked at me surprised. "You kept those?" "I never thought they were mine to throw away," I said, "but they were never in the way either." He nodded, eyes wet but steady. That day, we didn't just clean out a storage unit. We made space for grief, for memory, for something new. At home, Robert and I began having conversations we'd avoided for years. Not about Daniel, but about us, about what we wanted the next decade to look like, about retirement, travel, the possibility of downsizing. For the first time, those talks didn't feel like I was negotiating my place. They felt like planning a shared future. "I didn't realize how much I relied on you being adaptable," Robert admitted one night. "I confused your patience for endless capacity. I let you because I thought love meant flexibility without limits." We both learned from that. Love, we discovered, needs edges to keep its shape. I also started saying no more often. No to hosting when I was tired. No to smoothing over uncomfortable truths. No to carrying emotional labor that wasn't mine. Each no felt like a small rebellion at first, then like a relief. Daniel noticed. "You don't rush to fix things anymore," he said once. "I'm not broken, and neither are you." That summer, I celebrated my birthday in a way I never had before. I invited friends, I chose the menu, I didn't worry whether anyone would be uncomfortable or unimpressed. Daniel showed up with a simple gift and an awkward smile. "I didn't know what to get you," he said, "so I got you something you like." It was a book I'd mentioned months earlier. I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with grand gestures. As the years moved on, people outside our family noticed the change too. Friends commented on how calm I seemed, lighter. I realized then that emotional safety doesn't just change your home, it changes how you move through the world. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think back to that Christmas dinner, the scrape of the chair, the way the room had gone quiet, the heat rising in my face. I used to replay it with a sense of dread. Now I replayed it with clarity. That was the moment I chose myself without abandoning others. The moment I learned that standing firm doesn't require cruelty. Daniel and I never talked about that night in detail again. We didn't need to. Its lesson lived in how we treated each other afterward, in the way he asked instead of assumed, in the way I spoke instead of swallowed my words. If I could go back and speak to the woman I was before all of this, I wouldn't tell her to be braver. She already was. I would tell her to stop waiting for permission to take up space, to understand that peace bought with silence is temporary, and the cost is always yourself. Families don't heal because someone finally wins. They heal when someone finally refuses to keep losing quietly. And if they don't heal, if the truth is too heavy for some people to carry, then walking away with your dignity intact is not failure. It's wisdom. That Christmas dinner shocked everyone because it interrupted a pattern. Patterns survive on predictability, and I had finally become unpredictable in the one way that mattered most. I chose honesty over harmony, and in doing so, I found a deeper, steadier kind of peace. Time has a way of revealing whether change is real or just performance. Months turned into another year, and the improvements didn't fade. If anything, they deepened. Not because we talked about that Christmas over and over, but because we lived differently after it. Consistency, I learned, is the only apology that really lasts. Daniel moved closer to the city for work, which meant we saw him less, but when we did, it was intentional. He didn't drop by unannounced anymore. He called. He asked. That alone told me how much it shifted. Respect often shows up in the smallest behaviors. One afternoon, he invited me to lunch near his office, just the two of us, no agenda, no tension. We talked about work, about books, about how strange it feels when your life finally stops revolving around old pain. At one point, he looked at me and said, almost casually, "You know, I used to think strength was about control." "And now?" I asked. "And now I think it's about restraint," he said. "About not saying the thing that would make you feel powerful for 5 seconds and miserable for 5 years." I smiled. "That's a hard lesson. Some people never learn it." He nodded slowly. I almost didn't. At home, Robert and I revisited the legal documents I'd brought out that night, not because we needed to prove anything, but because transparency mattered now. We updated our wills, had difficult conversations about fairness, inheritance, and expectations. Daniel was included in those conversations, not shielded from them. It wasn't easy, but it was clean. No secrets waiting to explode later. "I don't want surprises," Daniel said during one of those talks, "good or bad." "Neither do I," I replied. "Surprises are what happen when people are afraid to be honest." That honesty extended beyond money and property. It reached into old wounds. Daniel admitted that part of his anger came from watching his father survive heartbreak by leaning on me. He said once, voice tight, "It felt like you replaced her in ways I couldn't, not as my mother, as his anchor." I didn't rush to defend myself. I said, "I didn't replace her, I just showed up in a different chapter. Both things can be true." He sat with that for a long time. Then he nodded. Acceptance doesn't always arrive with relief. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a door closing on a draft you didn't realize was there. I noticed changes in myself, too. I stopped apologizing reflexively, stopped explaining my choices unless I genuinely wanted to. When conflict arose, I didn't default to smoothing it over. I asked questions. I listened. I spoke. That balance felt revolutionary. One evening, a neighbor stopped by to chat and remarked, "You always seem so calm." I almost laughed. Calm wasn't something I'd ever been described as before, but it was true. Calm had replaced vigilance. That winter, another Christmas approached. I realized I wasn't measuring my worth against how smoothly the day went anymore. If someone crossed a line, I trusted myself to address it. If someone was uncomfortable, I let that be theirs to manage. Emotional adulthood, it turns out, is deeply unattractive to drama. Christmas dinner that year was ordinary. Beautifully ordinary. No speeches, no tension. Daniel helped clean up without being asked. At one point, he caught my eye and smiled. Just a small, genuine smile. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement of how far we'd come. Later, as I packed leftovers into containers, he said, "I used to think you stayed because you were afraid to leave." I paused, then looked at him. "And now?" He said, "And now I know you stayed because you chose to. That's different." "Yes," I said softly, "it is." That night, after everyone left, I sat alone again in the living room, lights dimmed, the house peaceful. I thought about the woman I was at that table years ago, humiliated, exposed, underestimated. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her that this wasn't the end of her story, that the quiet strength she felt in that moment would echo farther than she could imagine. If you're listening to this and wondering whether speaking up will cost you everything, I won't lie to you. Sometimes it costs you comfort. Sometimes it costs you relationships that were only surviving because you were silent. But what it gives you back is something no one else can hand you: self-respect. And once you have that, the world rearranges itself around you in surprising ways. There's a strange moment that comes after everything settles, after the dust is cleared and the crisis is past, when you finally see the full shape of what you've lived through. Not just the pain, but the patterns. Not just the hurt, but the habits that allowed it to last as long as it did. That's where I found myself in the years that followed, no longer reacting, but reflecting. Daniel and I reached something that felt like mutual adulthood, not friendship in the traditional sense, but respect without conditions. He stopped testing boundaries, and I stopped anticipating attacks. When he visited, he treated the house like a shared space, not a territory to defend. When he spoke to me, it was direct, not performative. That mattered more than any apology ever could. One afternoon, he surprised me by asking for advice, real advice, not about his father, not about family history, but about his own life. He was considering a career change and felt torn between security and fulfillment. As he spoke, I realized something quietly astonishing. He trusted my judgment, not because I had authority, but because I had earned credibility by being consistent, fair, and honest. You don't have to decide everything at once, I told him. You just have to stop choosing based on fear. He nodded, thoughtful. You're good at seeing that stuff. I had a lot of practice choosing fear, I said with a small smile. I recognize it easily now. Robert and I, too, had changed. Our marriage became more equal, not just in theory, but in daily practice. He stopped assuming I would absorb emotional fallout. He stopped asking me to manage everyone's comfort, and I stopped doing it without being asked. We learned that partnership isn't about protecting each other from discomfort. It's about standing beside each other while facing it. One evening, he said something that stayed with me. I thought love meant keeping everyone calm, he admitted. But calm built on silence isn't peace. It's tension waiting to explode. I squeezed his hand. Peace has to be honest to last. That honesty extended outward, too. I began to notice how often women my age were still apologizing for existing, for taking up space, for wanting more. Friends confided in me about family dynamics that mirrored mine, adult children who disrespected them, partners who stayed neutral, households where harmony depended on one person swallowing everything sharp. I listened, and when they asked what I did differently now, I didn't offer slogans or dramatic advice. I told them the truth. I stopped negotiating my dignity. That sentence unsettled some people. It inspired others, but it was always honest. Daniel eventually invited me to meet his new partner properly, not casually, intentionally. We sat down together over dinner, and I watched how carefully he navigated the evening, how attuned he was to tone and tension. Growth doesn't erase the past, but it reshapes the future. I saw that clearly in him. At one point, she said, "Daniel talks about you a lot." I raised an eyebrow. "Only good things, I hope?" He laughed. "Mostly. Warnings about what happens when you underestimate someone." That made all of us smile. As the years went on, the house itself felt less symbolic. It wasn't a battleground or a trophy or a memory vault. It was just home. The legal papers remained important, but they no longer carried emotional weight. They were safeguards, not weapons. I understood now that security doesn't threaten love, it supports it. Sometimes, though, I still thought about that first Christmas dinner, not with pain, but with clarity. I saw how easily that moment could have gone differently. I could have left in tears. I could have apologized for existing. I could have disappeared to preserve an illusion of peace. And if I had, the pattern would have survived, stronger, hungrier. Instead, I chose calm truth over dramatic exit, and that choice changed the trajectory of everything that followed. If there's a lesson in my story, it's not about winning arguments or proving worth. It's about timing, about knowing when silence is kindness and when it's self-erasure, about recognizing the moment when speaking up isn't reckless, it's necessary. Some people will never like the version of you that sets boundaries. That's not because you've changed for the worse. It's because you've changed in a way that no longer serves their comfort. And that's okay. Because the people who grow with you, who adjust instead of attack, who listen instead of dominate, those are the relationships worth keeping. The rest, they were only ever held together by your silence. By the time another year passed, I stopped thinking of my life in terms of before and after that Christmas. It no longer felt like a dividing line. It felt like a turning point that had been fully absorbed, folded into who I was now. The lesson wasn't sharp anymore. It was settled, like something learned deeply enough that you don't have to keep reminding yourself of it. Daniel and I reached a rhythm that felt natural. We didn't overperform closeness. We didn't avoid each other either. When he called, it was because he wanted to talk, not because he felt obligated. When I offered an opinion, he considered it without defensiveness. Sometimes he took it, sometimes he didn't. Either way, I no longer felt dismissed. One afternoon, while we were walking through a park near his apartment, he said something that made me stop. "I think I was testing you all those years." I looked at him. "Testing me for what?" "To see if you'd leave," he said. "Everyone else did, in one way or another." I let that sit between us. "I didn't stay because I passed a test," I said gently. "I stayed because I made a choice. And when that choice stopped being healthy, I changed how I showed up." He nodded slowly. "That's the part I didn't understand. I thought staying meant tolerating anything." "It doesn't," I said. "It means staying aligned with yourself." At home, Robert and I downsized the clutter of old expectations. We donated things we'd held on to out of guilt or habit. We rearranged rooms to suit who we were now, not who we used to be. The guest room became an office for me, a space that was fully mine, no apology attached. One evening, while helping me move a desk, Robert said, "You know, the house feels different because you stopped asking permission to exist in it." I smiled. "I didn't realize I was asking." "You were," he said. "So was I, in my own way." That honesty brought us closer than any years of quiet compromise ever had. We laughed more, disagreed more openly, resolved things faster. Our marriage became less about maintenance and more about mutual respect. I also noticed how my reactions changed outside the family, at the grocery store, at work, with acquaintances. When someone spoke over me, I didn't shrink. When someone made an unreasonable request, I didn't scramble to accommodate. I wasn't harsh, I was clear. And clarity, I discovered, is incredibly grounding. Daniel noticed it too. "You don't get rattled," he said once. "I do," I replied. "I just don't hand the steering wheel to the feeling anymore." That fall, something unexpected happened. Daniel asked if I would join him and his partner for a holiday trip, not out of politeness, out of inclusion. I declined, honestly. I wanted a quiet season that year. He accepted that without question. And in that small exchange, I saw just how much it changed. There was no guilt, no pressure, no narrative of rejection, just mutual respect. As winter came back around, friends asked me if the holidays were still hard. I thought about it carefully before answering. "They're not heavy anymore," I said. "They're just days." That's when I realized the power of what had shifted. The holidays had lost their emotional leverage over me. They were no longer a test of my worth or my place. They were simply moments I could choose to engage with on my own terms. On Christmas Eve that year, I lit a candle and sat quietly by myself for a while. I thought about how many women sit at tables like the one I'd sat at years before, swallowing humiliation because they believe endurance is noble, because they believe leaving would mean failure, because they believe silence is the price of belonging. I wished I could tell them what I know now. Belonging that costs you your dignity isn't belonging. It's compliance. You don't have to be loud to be firm. You don't have to be cruel to be clear. And you don't have to walk away from everyone to stop abandoning yourself. Daniel sent a message that night, just 3 words. "Thank you for staying honest." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then replied, thank you for growing. That exchange felt like closure in its purest form, not an ending, but a mutual acknowledgement of change. When I went to bed that night, the house was quiet, peaceful, fully mine in every sense that mattered. And for the first time, I didn't measure the silence as tension. I measured it as ease, the kind that comes when nothing is being swallowed, nothing is being rehearsed, nothing is waiting to explode. Just space and truth and rest. As the years settled into something gentler, I realized that healing doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where a bell rings and you're declared whole. Instead, it shows up quietly in how you react when something old tries to return and how little it succeeds. Daniel and I still had moments of friction. That never disappeared entirely. But the difference was profound. When tension surfaced, it no longer carried history like a weapon. It was just a moment, addressed and released. No one stormed out, no one kept score. One afternoon, while helping Robert sort through old files in the garage, I came across a familiar folder, the same one I'd placed on the table that Christmas night. I held it in my hands for a long moment, surprised by how little emotion it stirred now. It wasn't power anymore. It was protection. There's a difference, and knowing it felt like growth. "You want to keep that?" Robert asked. "Yes," I said, "not because I need it, because I earned the right to have it." He nodded, understanding. That evening, Daniel came over unexpectedly, not to challenge anything, not to test, just to talk. We sat on the back porch as the sun dipped low, the air warm and familiar. "I've been thinking about that night," he said suddenly, "not in the way I used to." I waited. He continued, "I thought humiliating you would make me feel powerful. Instead, it exposed how small I felt." I looked at him carefully. Most cruelty comes from fear. The problem is it never fixes it. He nodded. "I'm glad you didn't leave like that." "So am I replied, "but I would have if it had stayed the same." That truth mattered. Staying wasn't unconditional. It was conscious. As time passed, I became something I never expected to be in this family, a reference point. When disagreements arose, Daniel would sometimes say, "Let's slow down," echoing words I'd used years earlier. When Robert felt tempted to smooth something over, he'd stop himself and ask what honesty required instead. I didn't orchestrate that. I didn't demand it. It happened because I modeled it. I also learned to let go of outcomes. I stopped measuring success by how well everyone got along. Some days were messy, some conversations ended unresolved, and that was okay. Control was never my job. One winter afternoon, a neighbor asked me how we'd fixed things after such a public rupture. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. We didn't fix it. We stopped pretending it wasn't broken. That honesty, I found, is contagious. If there's one thing I carry forward from all of this, it's the understanding that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It shows up in how you sit at the table, how you speak when your voice shakes, how you refuse to disappear even when disappearing would be easier. That Christmas dinner shocked everyone because it disrupted a long-standing arrangement, one that required my silence to function. When that silence ended, everything else had to rearrange itself. And here's the quiet truth no one tells you. When you stop playing the role that keeps others comfortable, you discover who is capable of growing with you. Those people stay, the rest fall away. Both outcomes are information. I don't regret the pain of that night. I regret only how long it took me to believe my presence deserved respect without conditions. Now, when I sit at that same table, I don't brace myself, I don't rehearse, I don't shrink, I simply arrive as I am, and that has been more than enough. By the time the next Christmas rolled around, I could feel the difference in the air the moment I walked in the door. Not just because the house smelled of pine and cinnamon, but because nothing in me flinched. There was no tension hiding behind my ribs, no tight coil of anticipation, no rehearsed calm to protect myself from humiliation. I had learned that year and the years that followed that real peace doesn't come from controlling other people. It comes from claiming your own space, your own voice, and refusing to let anyone shrink you out of fear or habit. Daniel arrived with his partner, both of them smiling nervously as they stepped inside. The memory of his words from that fateful Christmas, "Get out," felt distant now, a sharp note that had faded into context. He didn't need to test me anymore, and I didn't need to brace myself. The air between us was quiet but comfortable. He helped with the dishes, offered to carve the turkey, even commented on the way the tree lights reflected off the ornaments in a way that reminded me of simpler Christmases. Robert watched from across the room, a small smile tugging at his lips. He no longer needed to smooth over my feelings or carry the emotional load. We had built a partnership that was reciprocal, where honesty was valued over appearances and respect was non-negotiable. That night, I realized something I hadn't grasped in all the years of tension. Boundaries weren't just for protection, they were a foundation for love, for connection that didn't cost you your dignity. At dinner, Daniel leaned back in his chair and for the first time in decades made a toast, not at me, not at himself, but at all of us. To growth, he said quietly, and to showing up. His words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. I met his eyes and nodded. We didn't need speeches. We didn't need performances. We just needed acknowledgement, and it was finally mutual. After dinner, we lingered over coffee, and I realized how much this family had changed. Daniel didn't provoke, he didn't assert dominance, he didn't measure my worth by my compliance. He had learned, slowly and painfully, what it meant to coexist with someone whose existence demanded respect. And in learning that, he had begun to soften, to reflect, to grow. I felt no triumph, just clarity, just relief, just life. Later, as the house quieted and the guests departed, I sat alone in the living room, the soft glow of the tree lights washing over the room. I thought about the long, painful journey that had brought me here, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, the anger, the fear, the moments of doubt when I thought leaving would be easier than standing my ground. I realized that all of it had been preparation. That night had forced me to articulate, to enforce, to finally own my life without apology. That is a gift I could never have anticipated. I also thought about the moral that had emerged from all this, not one I could have articulated before I lived it. Life does not reward the silent, the accommodating, or the endlessly self-sacrificial. Life rewards those who claim themselves, who protect themselves, who insist quietly and clearly that their existence, their voice, and their dignity matter. That doesn't always make others happy, but it makes the world bearable, and it teaches others the value of respect in ways no argument ever could. And as I sat there, alone but complete, I understood the final lesson. The people who are meant to stay will grow with you. The people who cannot respect that will fall away. Both outcomes are gifts, even when they feel painful. Daniel's initial cruelty had been a test, and I had passed, not because I had fought him, but because I had refused to let him define my value. I had refused to disappear, and in doing so, I had redefined the rules for everyone else. That Christmas, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel like I had won against anyone. I felt alive. I felt real. I felt anchored in a home that was mine as much as anyone else's, not because of ownership papers, but because of the integrity I brought to every corner of it. I realized that the real shock that night, when Daniel had humiliated me, wasn't the confrontation itself, it was what came afterwards, the refusal to leave, the insistence on truth, the calm assertion of self. That is what changed everything. If you are listening to this, know this. Your presence is not negotiable. Your voice deserves to be heard. Your dignity is yours, and no one has the right to diminish it. Speaking up does not make you cruel. Standing firm does not make you selfish. Choosing yourself is not betrayal. It is wisdom, it is strength, and it is the quiet, unshakable foundation from which real love, respect, and connection can grow. That night, as I finally turned off the tree lights and walked through the quiet house, I knew one undeniable truth. I had faced humiliation, I had faced fear, I had faced injustice, and I had stayed. Not to prove a point, not to triumph over anyone, not even to be loved. I had stayed because I was finally willing to exist fully without apology. And that decision, I realized, was the most radical, powerful act I had ever committed. The house, the family, even Daniel's initial cruelty, all of it had led to this, a Christmas where I could sit in peace, fully seen, fully respected, fully myself. And that, above all, was the gift I would carry forever. The end.